So without even mentioning Margaret Fuller, Jane Addams was part of the cloud of witnesses who connect us today to Fuller. Her experience of the genuine relationship across the boundaries of religion and nationality is also what Fuller felt during her time in Rome and what she tried to convey to Addams' father and all the other readers of the Tribune. Just as Fuller's own father had conveyed to her his love of learning and classical culture, so Addams' father, a gentler but equally earnest soul, conveyed to his daughter a sense of world citizenship. And speaking here with John, I just have to think about yet another father-daughter pair, Bronson and Louisa May Alcott. And since I'm the father of a daughter, this is a particularly meaningful part of the witness of saints that we're reflecting on today. So the words of both Fuller and Addams came to cross the boundaries of time, letting us join in their inspiring fellowship. Addams' narrative also highlights the aspect of Margaret Fuller's life that I'd like to talk about today. Her place in what we might call the American radical tradition, or the left, the communion of women and men who've worked over the past 2 centuries to make the lived experience of these United States conform more closely to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the revolution that began this country. For the past few years, I've been writing a book on the role of religion within this radical tradition. And one of the things I've wrestled with is the question of when American radicalism became a coherent tradition and not just a set of distinct and autonomous movements. At what point did people working for racial liberation, and people working for gender equality, and people working for a cooperative economic order come to see themselves as part of a shared struggle? I've come to believe that the crucial decade was precisely the decade of Margaret Fuller's public career, from roughly 1837 to the end of the 1840s. Prior to that time, the social values that we now associate with the left were promoted by rather different groups of people, often with little interaction with one another. Peace activists tended to be old New England Federalists offended by the War of 1812, including some who minister to this congregation. White people who were critical of slavery were just beginning to listen to African Americans and rarely saw connections between chattel slavery and wage slavery. Labor activists tended to distrust organized anti-slavery, as did many inspired by Hosea Ballou, also a former minister of this congregation and its many predecessor bodies. Some activists saw church structures as a foundation for social reform. Others feared anything that looked too much like an established church. As a young woman in the 1830s, Margaret Fuller held attitudes that reflected that fragmentation. Though she cherished her own educational privileges and wished other women could share them, she was dismissive of abolitionists, whom she regarded as brash and uncultured. She was even less interested in the working men's movement that was beginning to organize workers and anticipate the themes of socialism. But then a few things happened to draw radicals together. Not, let me be clear, into one big happy family, but at least into a common conversation of struggle and debate. Fuller had an interesting connection to each of these shifts. First, 1837 was the year of the Panic of 1837, one of the great economic crises of the 19th century, akin to the Great Depression of the 20th. As would be the case during the Great Depression, the Panic of 1837 contributed to an upsurge in radical activity. Facing the failure of existing institutions, reformers became revolutionaries. It was, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson, as if a trumpet had sounded to bring everything to judgment. From Christianity and commerce to schools and farms. This was especially so for people who lost their professional class privileges as a result of the crisis. In Fuller's case, she had lost those privileges a few years earlier as a result of her father's death and the resulting responsibility for caring economically for her mother and siblings. The family tragedy, as we've heard from Dorothy, propelled Fuller into the specific activities that made her a feminist trailblazer, conducting conversations for women, editing the Dial. Several of Fuller's transcendentalist friends responded to the economic crisis by organizing utopian socialist communities, places where people would do both manual and mental labor, overcoming the traditional division between the classes. Though Fuller never joined the Brook Farm community, she was its steadfast friend, and her friendship with its members helped her see that the individual growth she so cherished could be fostered by transformed social institutions.